the brain registers learning as pain. And the reason it's not that learning is painful, it's that the side effects of learning are painful.
An idea is just a rumor until it gets into the muscle.
You cannot grow and look good at the same time.
Don't practice when you're asking for a raise. Don't practice when you're in a job interview. Practice everywhere where the stakes are really low. Welcome again, Yoav. For anybody who doesn't know my friend Yoav Cohen, he's a good buddy, and we've worked together over the years. And he's currently the president of a company called Formula, a consultancy and software development company. The last time we got together, we had a talk primarily about giving feedback and sort of sharing our perspective with people that we work with and people in general in our lives. But one of the topics that we sort of stumbled on was the way in which we both approach learning. And so today we're going to dig into that in a little more detail. And to say a little bit more about that, we're going to talk about learning and also specifically the task of what we call modeling, which modeling is really coming from NLP or neuro-linguistic programming. To put it simply, it's really like, how do you spend time studying somebody and what are their patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving so that they can get a particular result? And modeling has been a fascination of mine. I think even before I knew about NLP, I was always intrigued, why is it that one person can get amazing results in a particular domain and someone might struggle? And, it never made sense to me because I felt like we all have the same basic neurology. So why does one person look forward to public speaking and someone else is like terrified in that context? So that's what we'll be up to in this talk. And welcome, Yoav. Good to see you again.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So I thought a good place to start with this, and I do want to say this is going to be more of a conversation versus me trying to model Yoav. It's going to be much more in both directions. I think we're both curious about how we approach learning projects, and we're both very avid learners. So what I thought would be a good place to start was that sort of the initial impulse when you have this moment of like, oh my God, I want to learn that thing, or I want to learn about that person. So I'm curious, how does that begin for you?
There's many things with me. I think it starts with my ego.
Say more.
Usually I will see someone that does something. I definitely had that when it comes to public speaking and speaking in general. I met along the way some phenomenal speakers, and I would watch them, and there would be this kind of like a combination of, oh my God, they're so much better than me. And why am I not as good as them at speaking? And there was another part of that, which is admiration. I'm also, me personally, I'm a competitive guy. And so the minute I see someone that does something that I want, and they do it better than me, then it's an interesting combination between beating myself up why I'm not as good as them. And there's another element there, which is about humility, because in order to learn from someone, you actually need to take on the position of humility, right? If Rob does something and he's better than me at doing that, let's say speaking, and I don't have the position of humility to show up as a student, then it's going to be really hard for me to learn.
So for you, the impetus is that seeing somebody and there's sort of this comparison and you're like, oh my God, why is this person better? I think sometimes the catalyst for me is seeing someone else, definitely. Especially when it comes to great teachers, because I think when I was a little kid, I just knew that there were certain teachers that just really made me want to learn, and their class was like fun, and they were great storytellers, and there was all this ease. And then with other teachers, they would sort of shut me down, and I think that very much was the beginning, at least in the domain of teaching. Like I was like, oh, I want to be like that. That's going to be amazing. Or sometimes it's like that. I want to be like Michael, right? You see Michael Jordan, you see an athlete that just has all this excellence, and you want, I want some of that for me also. And maybe there is a piece of wanting some of the admiration that the person is garnering, right? I remember seeing Bruce Lee as a kid and just thinking like, wow, that's the coolest thing in the world. Like I want some of that, right? And just watching the films again and again and again. All right, so that's the starting point. And then where do you go from there?
Before that, I'm curious, when you see someone that you want to learn from, do you already have the vision that, or the knowing, the internal knowing that I can be as good, not necessarily as good as them, but I see myself already doing this activity at a different, skill level than I'm currently in? It kind of like goes to this video that you sent me of Ira Glass, where he says you already have a good taste of what something should be like, but you're lacking the skill. And so that gap that's the distance that you need to cross. Is that what it is, that you already have the good taste of what a good teacher is?
Well, I definitely have, I think I have that same experience. Like I have that internal bar, or, that standard or taste, as he says. I think with some models or some exemplars, I immediately can see like, oh, I could do that, right? Or, I have a sense that I could grow into that. With others, maybe they're just outside of my normal range of behavior. So others, I think I can learn a lot from them, but I won't be at level, or it will manifest in a very different way for me. And I think that's an important point that I want to make, that modeling is not, it can be, but it's not always about you being just like Miles Davis. Like there's enough Miles Davis in the world, but maybe it's gleaning something about how someone like Miles Davis thought, so that you could be kind of the Yoav version of a Miles Davis, which is very different. So it's, it's less about imitation and it's more about understanding the kind of context of their thinking. So,
and also, I think that if you model Miles Davis in entirety, then you also need to model being, I don't know, a coke addict, right?
yeah, exactly.
Like,
yeah,
you don't model everything. It's an opportunity to carve out what is it that you want to not demonstrate, but pick up from someone else, like a certain quality or behavior.
absolutely. And that's I want to point out that that's I think a key skill in modeling, that I was fortunate enough to have a teacher who pointed this out when I first started studying this. And he said, you almost want to make an agreement with your unconscious mind that any aspects of the model that don't fit you or don't fit your values, you'll discard. So when we study somebody, it doesn't mean we have to take on everything. We don't have to take on all their beliefs or their values or anything like that. Because like you're saying, Yoav, with Miles Davis, like I don't want to need to become a drug addict in order to do that, right?
Yeah.
So learning to separate out the bits that you like.
Yeah.
And for me, that really frees me up, because it actually expands the range of people that I can model. Because if I had to take on everything, there's so many people I would immediately disqualify.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there nowadays, are there specific topics that you find yourself really passionate about learning and modeling someone else?
I mean, for me, it's an ongoing endeavor. I think I do it a couple different ways. Like for example, the the behavior, or the collection of behaviors around feedback, that's sort of an interesting theme. And so I might look for bits of that from many people, and always trying to figure out how can I improve in that one domain, right? Or, it might be something like, maybe I'm not particularly detail oriented at work, and I think, wow, that could really help. So I'm looking for people who are detail oriented and getting little bits from different people, sort of Frankensteining, um, as opposed to a whole ability or a particular person.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think what's been. Well, I'll come back to that question. I'm sure as we'll all remember, like, oh yeah, this is what I'm sort of currently thinking about. How
Mm-hmm.
about you?
I think I'm still fascinated with this idea of of speaking, but it's not about the speaking. It's actually much more of it is about authenticity.
Hmm.
I remember watching Barack Obama speak,
Hmm. Hmm.
and and by the way, this is not a political statement, right? As a matter of fact, I probably am on the other side of the spectrum of Barack Obama, but I very much appreciate his ability to convey a message in a way that makes the other side actually feel something, right?
Hmm.
And when he does that in a way that feels very authentic. And that is something that I'm very much passionate about. Like, how do I not just come across, but actually be authentic in how I communicate with people, right? And
Hmm.
especially uh, in my role, obviously, I often speak to a lot of people, and how do I give them the experience of this is Yoav talking right now, and it's not some figurehead, but a human, right? And
Hmm.
having that human experience with someone else, that is something which you mentioned before, like lifelong. This is also like something which is lifelong for me, about learning and modeling and continuously just finding people that demonstrate that really well, right? And first of all, by the way, often those teachers of mine, I noticed that they move me, right? They actually create an effect within Yoav, and Yoav feels something, and I'm like, oh, how do I do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's one way that you sort of kick off a project, is just an ongoing question or desire to be able to do something in the world. The other thing I wanted to mention, that your example reminded me, and definitely Barack Obama, the first I heard him speak, like, I was just blown away. Like, I was definitely moved in a particular way. But the thing that occurred to me is, sometimes I'll see somebody and I know there's something special, but I can't quite put my finger on it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so in those moments, I'm like, wow, there's something here, and I'm gonna keep going back, but I may not. I mean, it's not like I can name it as an ability, like, oh, he's great at authentically expressing himself. No, it's not that at all. Like,
Yeah.
I'm feeling a particular impact or witnessing a certain impact, and then I get really curious about that. I'm also very curious about modeling things that seem more like qualities, or they're more ephemeral. Like, one of my teachers just is an incredibly kind person. So it's not like you go in the dictionary or the how-to book and, like, this is how to be kind. Like, it comes from a very deep place. And I think, on the one hand, we could say, well, that's impossible to model. But I think one of my teachers says, like, experience leaves clues. And I think when you're around that type of person again and again and again, you start to notice, like, okay, these are the patterns that maybe I can learn from.
Hmm.
So that's another way that it happens for me. It's like, it'll start as a very vague impression, and then I'm like, well, I want some more of that.
Yeah, I think that the I want more of that is something that often leads us to learn and model someone. And specifically for me, modeling is both such a pleasurable experience.
Mm.
It's very concrete, right? I'm seeing Rob and he does something, and it's very concrete for me to actually follow that and learn from that. But at the same time, it's also, there's a lot of research that shows that the brain registers learning as pain, right? And yeah, and the reason it's not that learning is painful, it's that the side effects of learning are painful. So for instance, let's say that Rob is a great painter, right? And I want to model Rob because I want to become a great painter as well. I admire that about Rob. I, first of all, need to contend with the fact that I have a limiting belief in my head that I will never be a great painter. And so much of my energy and effort is going to just be spent on just battling that, right? And so it's going to take me out of the zone of learning, because constantly I have this voice in my head, like, I will never be a great painter. I will never be a great painter. And I find that often the experience of learning, so much of it is just kind of like about chipping away at, first of all, your limiting beliefs. And the way that, the way that you go about it is that you accumulate little evidence by little evidence, one small evidence after the next, that slowly chips away that limiting belief. And then all of a sudden you're at this new spot. I very much had that with speaking, right? Like, you can probably detect from my accent, I wasn't born here. And so, like, speaking for me in a language that is not my mother tongue, was actually rather challenging to convey complex ideas, especially like emotional ideas, feeling-based ideas. And that is something that I remember just chipping away at that, which was incredibly painful, because you meet yourself there and you're like, I'm very far away from that. And I think the learning often like confronts us with that.
I want to mention a couple points about that. And I want to let me take a step back and say that for the record, for anybody in the NLP community that's listening, there are many different types of modeling, and there are different opinions even in the NLP community about, oh, this is real modeling, this is not real modeling. But I'll say a little bit about the different types. The original modeling that was done in the NLP community, at least as I understand it, was something very similar to method acting, where you spend time around the person and you're kind of going into this deep imitation where you're really sort of imagining that you are the person and you might be moving like them or responding or speaking like them. And you do that until you start to replicate the types of behaviors that they're getting. And then once you have that sort of this high level of imitation, then you might kind of reflect and develop a model of, okay, what am I doing now? Like, now I'm going to create a description of everything that I've taken on from this person. So that's one type of modeling. It's like a very deep imitation. Like, and that'll work really well maybe when you're modeling a chef or something like that. You're standing next to them, seeing what they're putting in, etc. On the other side, there are ways of modeling that are much more question-based, much more trying to tease out, and through interviewing and through creating prompts with the person, trying to understand it. Well, what are their underlying beliefs? What's their thinking around things? So it's not just that they're grabbing for a particular ingredient, but it's stopping them and asking them, hey, what got you to grab for that ingredient in that moment? So they're more cognitive models and then behavioral models. The other thing I just wanted to mention, based on what you were saying in terms of that you're running into your own beliefs, I would say we can separate a little bit the modeling from taking on the model or taking on pieces of the model and essentially learning them and practicing them. And one of my mentors and teachers, this guy named David Gordon, he points out that, as he puts it, we're not empty vessels. He says we're already full of it. Like, we have all of our experience and all of our beliefs. So it's not like you can just take a new model and just jam it in there. But one thing that you can do during the modeling process is you can practice sort of putting yourself to the side for a moment. Like when I see a limiting belief come up while I'm modeling, I'll say, okay, like I'll sort of make a note and I try to put it to the side and just pretend that I can do it in the way that the person does it. Now, when you're really going into acquisition, you might have to change your beliefs, like you're saying, like either incrementally, a little at a time, or really kind of write out new beliefs for yourself and practice those. So there are a lot of different ways you can handle that phase of learning. So I hope that helps some of the context around modeling.
As I'm listening to you, there are two things that comes to mind. What does practice mean when it comes to modeling and learning?
I mean, for me, the practice phase is usually when I already have an idea of some of the pieces of a model. I'm going to think of an example. Well, so I've been modeling a lot of different artists, and one place that I get into a lot of trouble is with perfectionism or kind of fear of the blank page, and et cetera, et cetera. Over time and modeling different people and everything, one thing I realized is that if I pause when I'm sitting down to make a drawing or to make something, if I pause and perhaps even meditate for 5 or 10 minutes, it actually shifts me into a different part of my brain where I'm less self-critical, and then I'm actually able to engage in drawing. So that's the how. But the practice is remembering to do that and doing it often enough that it starts to become secondhand. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
In our talk last time, you were saying that if you notice uncomfortable feelings in your body when you're going into potentially talking about feedback, you've learned that you have to stop and pause and kind of center yourself. So again, that's the how. Now, if I'm going to practice that, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to have that trigger of body. First of all, I have to notice that. Maybe I have to put a Post-it on my computer to remind me, like, check your body. And then, okay, take a moment and center yourself. Do I know how to do that? And then really it's a question of practicing that again and again until it gets into the body. I think I shared this quote with you that I heard from another NLP kind of founder, Robert Dilts. He said that an idea is just a rumor until it gets into the muscle. And I love that idea, because it is like, well, we'll understand a concept about something, but then giving yourself different contexts where you can practice it again and again in a safe environment is so powerful, so that it can become muscle memory.
Yeah, I have a lot of experience with. The repetitiveness that is part of like learning and modeling someone. I think I mentioned that in our previous call, is that I can become a little bit obsessive with certain things and modeling people, especially when it comes to speaking and conveying a message. And I very vividly remember myself, still do, by the way, listening to recordings of calls or videos on YouTube again and again and again, and speaking it out loud, and then going into the wild and doing it over there. And well, it didn't actually work the way that I expected, or it didn't land the way that I wanted. And over the years, I guess like I almost like developed some kind of like a masochist in me that actually enjoy that process, right? It's like, God damn it, it didn't work this time. And then, I do it, but there's almost like an excitement, right? There's like a thinking of like, oh, well, perhaps I was, perhaps I said too much, or perhaps I didn't use enough of my hands, or perhaps I didn't smile, or I was in my head, or whatever that is. And finding the next opportunity to do that, like, I guess this is an important component of learning and modeling anything, right? Or anyone, which is the environment. You need an environment to practice that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I found really impactful was, as part of learning and as part of modeling others, is being part of a certain community, right? Being a part of a community. And that, like the old adage is that you become the 5 people that are closest to you, right? And
Right.
same thing here. Like, if you want to become a great leader, well, surround yourself with great leaders, and most likely you will become that over time if you just stick around for long enough, right?
Not the 5 people that are most important to you, the 5 people that you spend the most time with.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Uh-huh.
I have a couple questions about your process when you're listening again and again and again. How do you know when it's enough?
When I move
Like when
myself. So meaning when I actually created an emotional response within myself, and I guess that there is an element of actually imagining the other side. And sometimes I do that wrong, right? Like, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to get on this call and I'm going to say this and that, and then they will most likely feel this. And often that's not the case. And by the way, I would say that another thing that I this kind of like learned over the years is not to stay kind of like attached to what the other side should be doing as part of learning and
like their
modeling.
response. Yeah.
And the flexibility to just roll with whatever it is, and also often just to look bad, right? It's just I remember someone telling me, you cannot grow and look good at the same time. So first of all, it's part of the process of modeling and learning. You need to, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, this idea of humility, you need to actually be humble in order to learn something.
In my own experience, I had to find, and I still do this, context where I can practice, where it's okay to look like an idiot, right? I always tell people, you know, don't practice when you're asking for a raise. Don't practice when you're in a job interview or when you're proposing marriage. Practice everywhere where the stakes are really low, so that when the stakes are high, it's already part of your behavior.
Absolutely.
And so I've gotten pretty good at finding environments where I can try on new behaviors, and maybe it's with friends or people who have the same interests, so that I can make mistakes and it's okay, right? Otherwise, I get very rigid. I get very tight in my practice, and the stakes are too high.
Yeah, I'm experiencing that right now, actually, with creating this podcast or whatever it is that we're doing here, and producing the clips and the shorts and posting them, and what would other people think about me, and like watching myself. And I remember that for a long while I would watch myself and I had cringe, like I would literally like experience cringe,
Yeah.
and like all the judgment in my head starting to sound the alarm. And it's funny now when I look at myself, I think I'm much more objective about, oh yeah, first of all, this is me. And the other thing is, oh, I'm doing that well, that can improve. Okay, this has
Yeah.
potential. Like, I'm much more of an observer versus kind of like putting myself in the shoes of the most judgmental internet user that will now post a
Right.
comment and say, whatever it is, right?
I mean, that's a really important point. We can either kind of turn up our internal critic in such a way that it will shut us down.
Yeah.
Or we can kind of lighten up. I had to, I had so much stage fright when I was studying public speaking and things like that, that I really had to trick myself, because my internal critic was so high and I had so much anxiety. So being in environments where you could sort of play games with people were really useful for me. There's a speaking of public speaking, there's a great book called Be Heard Now, which is a play on the title Be Here Now, and it's by a guy named Lee Glickstein. I can't believe I'm remembering that, but in their methodology, they have these groups called speaking circles, and you go and everybody has to get up, and you might just get up for 2 minutes and you just talk about how your day was. And they record everything. And so even your first time they record it, and the instruction that they give you is they give you the recording and they say, go home and watch this 3 times back to back and do your best. Like, don't even, like, no internal critique, to the best of your ability, and see if there's anything that you notice that you can appreciate in your talk. And I remember the first time I watched it, I was like, oh my God, who is this guy talking? Like, oh my God, he's too thin. Like, he needs to eat. Like these are the thoughts that were going in my head. But then watching it 3 times, I was like, oh, that part was interesting. Like, oh, that wasn't bad, you know. And for me, that started to teach me to quiet that internal critic a little bit. But I'm a big fan of also practicing in a more private context first. The idea of, like, kind of putting things out there, and yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
In the early days when I watched myself on video, I would think my nose is too small.
Right, exactly. And it is, yeah. Me too. Yeah, exactly.
But you know, it like listening to you, it reminds me of this. So next month I'm actually starting an acting class, and I love those kind of experiences because they really, I mean, it's a cliche, like taking me out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
But you know, and I've done that with improv, and I've done that with dancing, and I've done that in various realms and you know, areas of life. And I'm always both incredibly terrified doing this, and also so excited. It's like 2 sides of the same coin, right? Fear and desire. And all those things, it's funny, like how learning in one area can actually be exported, so to speak, into another realm and another area that you want to grow or learn something, right? So I can definitely say that, you know, doing improv comedy and experiencing some of the most potent terror that I've ever experienced in my life. And granted that, you know, I've had like missiles drop on my head, right? It's like still does not compare to like being on stage and everybody watching me and I'm bombing. But I definitely, I can correlate and I can connect some of these experiences in improv comedy to how I actually speak, how I weave a story, how I listen to people, how, you know, the yes and all of that. So I guess like all of that to say, and it's something that I'm realizing only now, that there's almost like an interconnectivity between those different things that you learn and that you model in different areas of your life. And something that, you know, we are here in more of a, for lack of a better word, professional context, but so much of what I bring to the profession, to my professional life, actually I learned in my personal life that had nothing to do with business.
Right. Yeah, no, I think there's a richness in both directions. Some people are great in their professional life and they're not as great in their personal life, and that can go back and forth. I want to come back to, you know, your earlier comment about learning with a particular limiting belief and how do you interact with that. One thing I want to say about that is, in those moments, it's good to pause and realize that, to remind ourselves we are not our beliefs, even though we think we are. Like, to just have a little skepticism and say, yes, right now I believe that, but you know, maybe I believed in Santa at one point and I don't now. And that belief was learned. That was something that you had to learn, and you may have learned it before you could even remember, right? But just going like, oh, isn't that interesting? That's a belief, and how am I holding that belief, and holding it a little bit more loosely so that you can try some other things. The other thing I wanted to mention is, you know, in this talk, we're talking about modeling quite a bit. certainly modeling is not the only way to learn. Sometimes it can speed things up, but a great way of learning is really just putting yourself in the context as much as humanly possible, if you can stand the discomfort of being in the context, right? You want to learn a foreign language, put yourself in the context and force yourself to speak as much as possible, which is another sort of brute force way to learn, right? And
I very much remember that. I'm sorry. I very much remember in dancing, right? Because I love dancing, but at the same time, I felt excruciating pain when I was dancing because I felt so unnatural, and I felt so like everybody on the dance floor is just watching me. They stopped the world just to watch how ridiculous I look, right? And I very much remember, I did this class called 5 Rhythms, and I went week after week after week for 2 years. I was so darn consistent. Just week after week after week, I would show up on the dance floor, dance for 2 hours, experience just the most uncomfortable feelings. But boy, by the end of this 2 years, it's not that I was a great dancer, it's that I just enjoyed dancing. And I remember like going to a wedding with a past partner, and it was one of the greatest compliments someone ever given me. They came up to me and said, "Oh my God, you're such a great dancer. I really enjoyed just watching you." And that was, after 2 years of excruciating pain, that was so much fun for me and so meaningful to me to kind of like identify that journey.
Yeah. I have a question for you. What is it that you enjoy about going out of your comfort zone?
I mean, in the most blunt way, life is just too boring not to try. Yeah.
It's such an interesting border in our life, our comfort zone, right? It's like, oh yeah. And my own experience of myself, like I'm on the line between introvert and extrovert.
Yeah.
I would say I present more as an extrovert, but I'm actually more of an introvert. And I think of myself very much like a hobbit, like left to my own devices. I'd rather be at home and like snuggle up with a book. But then part of me like, oh, there might be an adventure out there, right?
Totally.
And I'm like, oh, I got to go outside. So,
and by the way, for me, just in that regard, modeling is my favorite way of learning because people are so interesting, and I personally, I just learned. I noticed myself learning so much faster by finding models that I want to, follow and kind of curate and adopt some of their behaviors. It is so much more flavorful for me than reading a book.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you and I have in common is I think we would do this regardless, right? Like for me, the endeavor of modeling is it's one of the most pleasurable things that I do, hands down. It's that type of thing. Like I would pay to model, like that's how much I enjoy it, right? And I think that's an important point because some people may not enjoy it that much. But I think it's an important point because we're both very busy. I know you're astronomically busy, and yet you still find time for that. Like that's remarkable in a way. That in spite of how busy you are, you still you find ways of fitting this into your life, right?
Yeah, and I can think of many times where I actually abandoned modeling someone. And when I reflect on why did I abandon someone or abandon, well, not someone, but the abandonment is more about wanting to develop a certain kind of skill or behavior or modeling a behavior versus the times that I actually stuck it out. I think it's very much about whether my ego was hooked, right? So for instance, in my case, in my personality architecture, speaking and conveying a message and moving people is something that my ego views as very important, right? It's key to my self-definition versus, I don't know, modeling someone about their, nutrition is not. It's like my ego is not attached there. And so, yeah, I might model you for like a couple of weeks, but, most likely it will fall by the sideway because it's not attached to something bigger than that.
I'm going to question you a little bit. I'm wondering if it's ego or if it's your values and your identity. Ego is a little bit of a pejorative term. It's like, oh, it's my ego.
Okay,
and I think sometimes it might be your ego, and it probably is. Definitely with me, sometimes I'm like, hey, why can that person do that? For me, that's the ego place. But sometimes it's just like, no, that's at an identity level. So something so important to me, I want to learn that. I think in my experience, like I love figuring things out in puzzles, and I will keep a question and I will keep working on it for years. And in fact, I do want to point out that sometimes that will slow the learning for me, because sometimes I prefer to figure something out on my own as opposed to look at the answer book, so to speak.
Totally.
So
just thinking about what you said, one is often, I think it's safe to say that we think the most interesting puzzle to solve is ourselves, right? Just going back to your comment about identity versus ego, I very much agree with you that, yes, I am speaking much more about identity, but I have used my ego to my advantage many times, right? Meaning, like, I understand that ego often is used in a pejorative way, but it can also be a great motivator if you just know how to harness it in the right context, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that could be a whole topic, I think.
Yeah.
I think maybe we come back and talk about ego versus identity. So we can have a cage match. All right. Well, why don't we leave it there for today? And then we'll come back next time.
Well, so before we leave, I'm curious to ask you something, just for the benefit of the multitudes that are watching this. What are some, you've been doing this for quite a while. Like, what are some recommendations or tips that you have for people as they go about modeling others?
Tip one, this is off the top of my head. I didn't put together a list of tips before the talk, is stoking the curiosity. Because as you're listening to this talk, the thing that I think Yoav and I are both demonstrating is that we have this intense curiosity about the people that we're modeling and about the abilities and what's the structure of that ability. So I think that's the first thing. And the part to that is at the outset, sometimes I like to write down what are my key questions, like what doesn't make sense to me about this. And for me, that's sort of like starting to prime the field for planting. So, that's the first thing. Second thing is find really good role models, really good exemplars, and definitely people that are open, hopefully people that are willing to give you some time if you can get access to them. In my experience, most people are willing to share their time for this, even though like people are a little surprised at first. I think I've only had, I had one person who kind of wanted it to be more of a negotiation. I think he actually wanted me to pay him. That's happened one time in hundreds of people over the years. And then there was one other guy who was just too busy, and he shared with me that he just really couldn't devote the time to it. But find a good exemplar, an exemplar that, they actually can do the ability that you're imagining, and perhaps doing it in a way that might be closer to your values or things like that. And then the third thing is really like kind of like you were speaking to more, is be willing to, it doesn't have to be a tidy experience. In fact, it will be a messy experience. people don't convey their experience in a linear way. Modeling somebody isn't like following a recipe, do this and this and this and this. Like, it's more like dusting off an artifact, and little by little the structure reveals itself to you. So be willing to get in there and get a little bit dirty. But what I found over the years is everybody that I've modeled, I've found at least one gem that I could not just use in that context, but use in many, many contexts. It's kind of a funny story. It's a true story. I modeled a friend who, believe it or not, had this ability to, he was great at going and buying shoes. And I just thought it was funny. So I was sort of modeling him more out of curiosity. But what I found in modeling that was there was a little piece that is so valuable in the negotiation context that I owe him for life, just because of that one piece that's had an impact of every negotiation that I've ever gone into. So those are my 3 tips.
You know, I was thinking just about your third tip, and I was actually taking the other position of like being a model for someone. Let's say someone wanted now to model how I speak. That would be actually pretty hard for me to give you, like you said, a recipe, because I'm not like, there is so much that goes into that, and there are so many layers that I accumulated over the years. So I love your tip about just take one thing and then keep on, kind of like just get good at that, and then keep on to the next model and curate one thing from them. And that is probably, yeah, that's probably a good way of going about it, versus trying to come up with a, lack of a better word, formula. I'm not doing a plug here, but you know, some kind of, you mentioned recipe, right? Like, well, you do A and then you do B and then you do C. It's, you know, obviously human beings are much more complicated.
No, you know, occasionally when I'm modeling somebody, and I've been doing modeling projects for years, occasionally the model will reveal itself in a very coherent way very early on. Rarely. More often what happens is I discover a little, it's like, oh, I discover a little piece here and a little piece here, and I can't see how they fit together, and it's this big jumbled mess. And then one day I'll be walking down the street and all of a sudden I'll be like, oh, this is how they fit together. And I'll start to understand the relationships between the pieces. The other thing I do want to say, and this is not a how-to video on modeling, but in response to something you were saying, Yoav, the people that we model do not know, and it's not their job to teach us how they do what they do. Our job is to be around them and to study clues and to begin to make sense of it. That's our job, and to think of really good questions to ask them, etc. But most people, if you ask them like, oh, how are you a great painter? They'll say, oh, I don't know, I just paint. Like, that's the number one answer you'll get, you know. And in fact, many people, if you ask them to model them, that will create some reluctance from them. They'll say like, well, I don't know how I do it, I just do it. I just learned that. I'm a natural. So.
People often ask me like, yo, how are you so great? And I'm like, I don't know how.
I was just born that way.
Cool.
All right. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Bye-bye.